Have you ever found yourself in one of those, really spirited debates, maybe about a tricky moral issue or a big life decision like changing careers?
Oh, definitely. Or even just arguing passionately about whether a movie was actually, like, good or beautiful.
Exactly. And what's interesting is these aren't just casual chats, are they? They're often conversations steeped in philosophy, even if we don't quite realize it at the time.
Well, yeah, and what's fascinating is that it's not just opinions flying around randomly. There's actually a whole field dedicated to understanding the nature of these judgments.
Right. And it gives us tools to navigate them. And that's really our deep dive today. Value theory. In its broadest sense, it's the philosophical look into what we mean when we judge something as ethical or social, political, even beautiful.
It's like a toolkit, really,
Yeah.
for understanding those tough debates about what you value and, maybe more importantly, why you value it.
So our mission today is to unpack what a value actually is, how it's different from a fact, which is crucial, explore some fundamental questions about what makes something good.
And dig into the nature of morality itself, and then maybe touch on how we judge beauty, both in art and, in life generally.
Okay, so let's start with something intriguing. Think about the surrealist René Magritte. There's this image of him painting a self-portrait.
Oh, I think I know the one you mean.
Yeah, he's looking at an egg, right? But on the canvas, he's painting a bird in flight.
Clairvoyance, that's the title.
That's it, clairvoyance. It suggests art isn't just about showing facts or what is. It's about imagining possibilities, what could be. And for me, that's a perfect metaphor for stepping beyond the is to the ought that values represent.
That's a great starting point. Because values are just so deeply woven into your life, aren't they? They guide your decisions, shape how you treat people.
Even define your personal style, your aesthetic.
They signify judgments about how people ought to think or feel or act, all based on what we consider good or worthwhile or important.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, if you decide to read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, your reason isn't just it's a book. It's likely based on a value judgment about its importance. Maybe it's literary greatness or the need to understand racial injustice. You're applying a value.
And this brings us right to a really key philosophical idea, the fact-value distinction. It separates what is the case, that's facts, from what people think ought to be the case. That's values.
And that distinction is vital, isn't it? Because it's so easy to mistake a strong belief, something you feel is truly good or bad, for an objective fact.
Absolutely. For instance, saying killing an innocent person is bad, that feels factual, but it isn't describing how the world is necessarily. It's describing how we believe it should be.
It really makes you pause and think about how many everyday statements sneak in a value judgment. Can you give us another clear example, maybe something simple?
Sure. Take the soup is salty. That's just descriptive, right? A fact about the soup.
Okay.
But if you say, this soup is too salty, now you've made an evaluation. You're implying it ought to be less salty. You've judged it against some standard.
Ah, I see. It's a subtle shift, but it's definitely moved from just observing to judging.
It's a powerful shift.
And I guess that's where we can run into logical problems like the naturalistic fallacy.
Indeed. The naturalistic fallacy is basically an error in reasoning where you assume you can derive values, what people ought to do, just from facts about the world, what is.
So trying to jump from is to ought.
Exactly. The philosopher G.E. Moore really nailed this down in his book Principia Ethica back in 1903. He argued that claiming X is good only because of its natural properties is committing this fallacy. Goodness isn't just another natural property you can point to.
We see this kind of argument all the time, though, don't we? Like people debating whether monogamy is good or natural by looking at animal behavior.
That's a classic example. Trying to derive a human ought from an animal is.
It seems like shaky ground.
Well, this idea has deep roots. David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, famously highlighted this ought problem in his treatise of human nature.
What was his take on it?
Hume noticed how writers would describe human affairs using is and is not, factual descriptions, and then suddenly they'd switch to ought or ought not.
Without explaining the jump.
Right, without justifying how this completely new kind of statement, an ought, could possibly be deduced from the is statements that came before. He said this subtle shift is of the last consequence. It's a really big deal.
So Hume basically suggested morality isn't just out there in the facts, it's tied more to us, to human sentiments, feelings, beliefs.
Pretty much. Facts describe relations between objects, but morality, for Hume, involves a human subject's feelings or judgments about a matter.
Okay, so if we can't just logically derive ought from is, where does that leave us when we try to define what's actually good?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Hume opened the door, and G.E. Moore really walked through it with his open question argument.
How did that work?
Moore used it to reinforce the point against that naturalistic fallacy. He said, look, even if you define something using all its natural properties, say, you describe pleasure in detail, the question, but is pleasure good? Still remains open. It's still a meaningful question.
Because good isn't just reducible to those natural properties?
Exactly. For Moore, goodness was a non-natural property.
Yeah.
You can't scientifically measure it or point to it like you can point to, say, yellow or hard. Saying pleasure is good isn't like saying lemons are yellow. If you define good as pleasure, then asking is pleasure good just becomes is pleasure pleasure, which tells you nothing.
That's fascinating. So good is something else entirely, but I imagine not all philosophers buy into such a strict separation between facts and values.
No, definitely not. You have moral realists, for example. They argue that morality does have an objective basis. They believe certain moral claims are objectively true.
So for a moral realist, murder is wrong isn't just an opinion.
Correct. They'd say it's an objective moral fact. Moral disagreements, for them, don't prove subjectivity. They might just mean we haven't fully grasped the moral reality yet, kind of like how scientists debate theories to get closer to the truth.
That's a really strong counterposition. And didn't the philosopher Hilary Putnam also raise objections?
Yes, Putnam had a very interesting argument. He pointed out that even science, which we often think of as purely factual, relies on values.
How so?
Well, scientists have to choose between competing theories, right? And they often do so based on values like simplicity or coherence or explanatory power. Think about Einstein's theory of gravity. It was accepted partly because it was elegant and fit well with other laws.
So the choice of facts or theories isn't entirely value-free.
That's Putnam's point. It suggests the line isn't quite as sharp as some might think.
And what about just everyday language? You mentioned the soup example. Sometimes saying something descriptive feels like it implies an evaluation.
Absolutely. Like saying, this knife is too dull to cut anything.
Yeah, that clearly implies that this is a bad knife.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because its function, its purpose, what philosophers sometimes call its telos or goal, isn't being fulfilled. So when purpose is involved, descriptive statements can easily slide into evaluative ones.
Okay, I get that. So if we define the purpose, we can then sort of objectively judge its goodness against that purpose. But doesn't that just push the question back? Who gets to define the purpose, the telos? Isn't setting the goal itself a value judgment?
That is a fantastic question. And yes, you've hit on a really core challenge. Defining a universal telos for, say, human life is incredibly complex. And you're right, often involves another layer of values. It's why this field is so fascinating. It's always digging deeper.
Okay, so we've wrestled with this tricky line between is and ought. But let's say we identify something as a value, something we think ought to be. Now, new questions pop up, right? Like, what kind of good is it? Is it good in itself or good for something else? Let's peel back that layer.
Right. We can start by distinguishing between intrinsic and extrinsic value. Something has intrinsic value if it's valuable just for its own sake, simply good in itself. Aristotle, for instance, thought happiness was like that, an end in itself. You don't seek happiness for something else. You seek it for its own sake.
And extrinsic value is the opposite.
It's when something is valuable as a means to an end. It's good for something else. Think about eating well. Eating a balanced diet isn't usually seen as good purely in itself, but it's extrinsically good because it leads to health. And health might be seen as intrinsically good, or good because it leads to happiness.
So the diet is a tool to get something else valuable.
Precisely. And this leads to another big question, fundamentality. Is there just one ultimate intrinsic value, or are there several?
So monism versus pluralism.
Exactly. Monism says there's only one fundamental intrinsic value that underlies all others. Hedonists, for example, believe pleasure is the ultimate good. A monist would try to guide everything by that single value.
But pluralism says there's more than one.
Yes, pluralism argues there are multiple fundamental intrinsic values that you can't just reduce to a single one. Maybe knowledge, love, beauty, justice. They could all be intrinsically good, but you can't just measure them all in terms of, say, pleasure.
The philosopher Martha Nussbaum, she lists quite a few, right? Things needed for a flourishing life.
She does. Things like life itself, health, affiliation, practical reason. A whole range of goods she sees as intrinsically valuable and distinct.
Okay, so what's the tension between those views? Monism seems simpler, maybe.
Simpler, perhaps, but pluralists worry it might oversimplify complex moral situations or even restrict freedom by forcing everything into one box. Monists, on the other hand, might argue pluralism makes it harder to resolve conflicts when different values clash, like in debates about physician-assisted suicide, where values like alleviating suffering might conflict with the value of life itself.
Yeah, how do you choose between two fundamentally different goods?
That leads perfectly into a key concept for pluralism: incommensurability.
Incommensurability. What's that?
It basically means that some goods or values lack a common standard of measurement. You can't meaningfully compare them on the same scale.
Like apples and oranges.
Kind of, but
Yeah.
maybe even more distinct. Like, you can't compare the speed of a cheetah to the size of the Taj Mahal. They just don't share a relevant metric.
Okay.
Similarly, the value you get from a deep friendship isn't really commensurate with the value of, say, having a lot of money. They're good in fundamentally different ways. You might have several friendships you deeply value, but find it impossible, or even wrong, to try and rank them numerically.
So if values can be so different, even incommensurable, how does moral pluralism stack up against moral relativism? They sound a bit similar.
They do sound similar, but there's a really crucial difference. Moral pluralism basically acknowledges, okay, different people, different cultures have different moral frameworks, and it's really hard, maybe impossible, to just unify them all neatly. It accepts complexity.
But moral relativism goes further.
Much further. Moral relativism claims that all those different moral frameworks are equally valid. It asserts that values are just determined by individuals or cultures, and there's no external standpoint from which to judge them.
So relativism would be like, that's true for you, this is true for me, and that's the end of it.
Pretty much. Which sounds tolerant, maybe, but it can lead to real problems.
How so?
Well, Martha Nussbaum again brings up the example of female genital mutilation. If you're a strict moral relativist, how can you condemn such a practice in another culture? Relativism seems to block any possibility of cross-cultural criticism or arguing for universal human rights. Nussbaum argues for a reasonable pluralism, instead respecting difference, while still holding on to some core, potentially universal values.
That makes sense. It seems we need some way to talk about values that goes beyond pure subjectivity, which brings us, I think, to metaethics.
Yes, metaethics.
Yeah.
This is where philosophy really digs into the foundations. It asks about the ontology of value, the very being or reality of values.
So questions like, where do moral values even come from? What does it mean to say something is right or good? Do objective moral facts exist at all?
Precisely. And that last question leads straight to the big debate between moral realism and moral anti-realism.
We touched on realism, the idea that moral values are objectively real. So anti-realism is the opposite.
Right. Anti-realism says ethical values are not based on objective facts about the world. Instead, they're grounded in something subjective, like individual emotions, beliefs, cultural agreements, desires.
Which could lead towards skepticism or relativism, making it hard to find common ground in moral arguments.
It can, yes. If moral statements are just expressions of feeling, how can we rationally debate them?
Okay, so if we're looking for potentially objective justifications for moral values, where have philosophers typically looked?
Well, one major historical source is, of course, divine or religious foundations.
God as the source of goodness.
Yes, either God being the ultimate good, the exemplar of virtues like God is loving, so we should be loving, or God as the ultimate lawgiver or judge, whose commands establish objective moral truths.
But that raises some tricky questions too, doesn't it? Like the Euthyphro problem from Plato?
The classic dilemma: is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is in itself good?
If it's good just because God commands it, doesn't that make morality seem arbitrary? Like God could have commanded cruelty and that would have made it good.
That's one horn of the dilemma, often called divine command theory. But if God commands it because it's already good, then goodness seems independent of, maybe even above, God, which challenges God's supreme authority. It's a tough philosophical knot.
Okay, moving away from the divine, what about natural or human foundations? Finding morality in the world or in ourselves?
Right. Some look to nature and natural law. The idea here is that good actions are those that align with the natural order or human nature itself.
Like Thomas Aquinas.
Aquinas is a key figure here, arguing for eternal laws. Natural laws derive from that, and human laws, which must align with natural law to be just. More recently, you have philosophers like Philippa Foot, associated with ethical naturalism. Foote argued, roughly, that moral judgments are about what's good or bad for humans, given our nature. Good actions help us flourish according to our natural way of being. Bad actions distort or hinder that flourishing. We can understand what's good for a human, kind of like how we understand what's good for a plant or an animal, by observing its needs and purpose.
So grounding morality in biological or natural facts about humans, that's interesting. What about reason, using our rational capacity?
Absolutely central, especially since the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Immanuel Kant wanted to find a basis for morality completely independent of religion or subjective feelings, grounding it purely in reason.
And that led to his categorical imperative.
Yes, the core idea is act only according to that maxim or principle that you could rationally will to become a universal law.
So basically, what if everyone did this?
Exactly. Take lying. Could you rationally will that everyone should lie whenever it's convenient? Kant argued no, because the very concept of lying relies on a general expectation of truth-telling. If everyone lied, language and trust would break down, and lying itself would become impossible. It fails the universalization test.
It's a purely logical test for morality. Fascinating. But what about our inner sense, our conscience, our emotions?
That's another important avenue of morality originating within the self. Some point to conscience or intuition as an inner guide. Others, like the ancient Chinese philosopher Mencius, emphasize innate compassion or empathy as the root of benevolent ethical actions.
And more recently, there's feminist care ethics.
Right. Thinkers like Nell Noddings argue that morality arises fundamentally from the experience of caring for others, emphasizing relationships, empathy, and responsibility over abstract rules. It offers a different perspective, often rooted in experiences traditionally associated with women.
That's a really rich landscape of where values might come from. But let's shift focus slightly. We've talked about what's good generally, but what about what's good for a person? What makes for a good life?
That's well-being, right, or flourishing.
Exactly. Well-being, or sometimes flourishing, focuses on what contributes to a life that is good for the individual living it. And philosophers have generally approached this in, well, three main ways.
Okay, what's the first?
The first is pleasure, often called hedonism. The basic idea is that well-being consists in maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain.
Like Epicurus.
Epicurus is a famous hedonist, yes, but maybe not in the way people often think. For him, the highest pleasure wasn't wild indulgence, but ataraxia, a state of freedom from mental, emotional, and physical pain and disturbance, achieved through moderation, virtue, and philosophy with friends.
A calmer kind of pleasure. And then there's utilitarianism. Thinkers like Bentham and Mill developed utilitarianism as a moral theory based on maximizing overall happiness, usually understood as pleasure, and the absence of pain for the greatest number of people. So pleasure becomes the metric for judging actions and policies.
But is pleasure really all there is to a good life? I'm thinking of that thought experiment, the experience machine.
Ah, Robert Nozick's famous challenge, yes.
Yeah.
He asks, if you could plug into a machine that would give you any experience you desired, perfect pleasure, success, love, but it's all simulated, you wouldn't know it's not real. Would you plug in?
Most people instinctively say no.
Right? Nozick thought so. He argued, we don't just want the feeling of pleasure. We want to actually do things, be a certain kind of person, have real contact with reality. Pleasure alone isn't enough.
That's such a powerful point. So if pleasure isn't the whole story, what's the second approach to well-being?
The second approach focuses on desire satisfaction, sometimes called satisfactionism. Here, well-being is seen as getting what you want, having your desires fulfilled.
That sounds plausible.
It does, but there are nuances. Often, it's specified as the satisfaction of informed desires. Because you might desire something based on bad information, like wanting to drink something that's actually poison, and satisfying that desire clearly wouldn't improve your well-being.
Right, you need to know what you're really wanting. This also seems connected to debates about whether our values are actual beliefs or just emotions.
Exactly. That connects to the cognitivism versus non-cognitivism debate in metaethics. If values are just desires or emotions, non-cognitivism, like emotivism suggested by A.J. Ayer, then good just means what I desire, or hooray for this. If values involve beliefs, cognitivism, then satisfying desires might need to align with some true beliefs about what's actually good for you.
Okay, so pleasure, desire, satisfaction. What's the third way?
The third approach involves objective goods. These are things considered to contribute to a flourishing life, regardless of whether you desire them or find them pleasurable at every moment.
Things that are just good for you, whether you realize it or not.
Kind of. Things like knowledge. Generally seen as good for humans, helps us make better choices, understand the world. Or virtue, or arete, as the ancient Greeks called it, meaning excellence.
Like Aristotle's idea.
Yes. For Greeks like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, virtue wasn't just about being morally good in our sense, but about excelling at being human. Just like a knife's excellence, or red, is being sharp, human excellence involves cultivating virtues like courage, wisdom, justice. Aristotle famously described virtue as a golden mean between deficiency and excess, like courage being the mean between cowardice and rashness.
And friendship was huge for Aristotle too, right?
Absolutely essential. He called it necessary for our life. He distinguished between friendships based on pleasure, utility, usefulness, and those based on virtue or character, where you value the friend for their own sake. Those character friendships, he thought, were the most important for true well-being.
So all these things, knowledge, virtue, friendship, contribute to what the Greeks called eudaimonia.
Exactly. Eudaimonia is often translated as happiness, but it's much richer than just feeling good. It means human flourishing, living well, a good spirit. It's about actively living a life of excellence filled with intrinsically valuable things.
It sounds less like a passive feeling and more like an active way of living.
It is, and it connects to other ideas too, like Kant's ideal of a kingdom of ends, where everyone treats each other with respect as rational beings, as ends in themselves. That's a vision of a flourishing society.
It also makes me think of the Japanese concept of ikigai.
Yes. Ikigai, often translated as reason for being. It's different from simple pleasure. It's more about finding that intersection of what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can be valued for. It's a sense of purpose and meaning that contributes deeply to well-being.
Okay, that covers a lot about the good life. But what about the value of beauty? We touched on it earlier. This is the realm of aesthetics, right?
Yes. Aesthetics is the branch of value theory, looking at how we evaluate art, nature, and other aesthetic experiences.
And the big debate there is objective versus subjective beauty.
That's a classic one. Ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle tended to see beauty as an objective quality in the object, related to things like harmony, proportion, symmetry. Think of the mathematical ratios in Greek sculpture. For Plato, experiencing beauty could even lift the soul towards higher truths.
But later thinkers challenged that.
Yes, especially in the Enlightenment. David Hume argued beauty is subjective, a matter of taste. It's not in the object, but in the feeling it produces in the observer. Though he did think taste could be refined and educated.
And Kant had a unique take.
Kant sort of split the difference. He agreed taste is subjective. There's no rule that proves something is beautiful. But, he thought, when we judge something as beautiful, we do it with a sense of universality. We feel that others ought to agree with us. It's different from just liking ice cream. Aesthetic judgments involve our faculties in a way that feels universal and, for Kant, prepares us to love what is good.
That's subtle. It feels different from just saying, I like it. And what about interpreting art? Does the artist's intention matter most? This relates to the intentional fallacy, doesn't it?
Exactly. The intentional fallacy is the idea that it's an error to assume the artist's intention is the sole or primary determinant of an artwork's meaning. Wimsatt and Beardsley argued forcefully that the meaning is in the work itself, how it functions, what it evokes. The artist's intention might be unknown, or they might have failed to achieve it. The work takes on a life of its own once it's out in the world.
Art seems like a place where values really become visible, reflecting what a society cares about or maybe challenging those values.
Absolutely. Aesthetics reveals so much about societal values. Who gets to make art, what subjects are considered worthy, how beauty is defined, and art often intervenes directly in ethical and social issues.
Like feminist aesthetics.
Yes, which uses art and art criticism to investigate sexism, challenge traditional notions of beauty often tied to the male gaze, and highlight the historical exclusion of women artists.
The Guerrilla Girls come to mind.
A perfect example. Their famous billboard, "Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum?" Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. That used stark facts to make a powerful value statement about representation and objectification.
And art also engages with nature, right? Environmental aesthetics.
Definitely. It challenges the old separation between art and the natural world. Think of the land art movement in the 60s and 70s.
Moving art out of galleries.
Into the landscape itself. Nancy Holt's sun tunnels, massive concrete cylinders in the desert, framing the sunrise and sunset on the solstices, connecting human scale to cosmic events. Or Anna Mendieta's powerful earth body works, creating a spiritual connection with the earth.
And art can be a form of environmental activism, too.
For sure. Like Camille Seaman projecting images of melting icebergs onto buildings and cities, making the distant threat of climate change immediate and unavoidable. It uses aesthetics to provoke thought, and, hopefully, action.
It's easy to focus on museums or grand nature, but what about beauty in just everyday life?
That's where everyday aesthetics comes in. It encourages us to pay attention to the aesthetic qualities of ordinary experiences, the way light falls, the taste of coffee, the texture of rain, choosing clothes.
Like the Japanese focus on small details.
Japanese aesthetics, often influenced by Zen Buddhism, emphasizes mindfulness, finding beauty in imperfection and impermanence. Wabi-sabi, like in a simple tea ceremony, or noticing cherry blossoms. It's described as finding the beautiful among the sordid facts of everyday existence. It can be a form of moral or spiritual self-cultivation.
Wow. Okay, so after this really deep dive, pulling all these threads together, what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think this journey into value theory gives you some really powerful tools. Tools to identify, question, and maybe even reformulate the values that shape your own life, your choices, your society. It helps you dissect why you value what you value.
And understand what really brings satisfaction or constitutes a flourishing life or a just society for you.
Exactly. It encourages a deeper level of reflection.
And maybe connecting back to Magritte at the start, painting the bird he envisions from the egg he sees it, leaves us with a thought. How much of what we take as everyday truth, just the way the world is actually built on deeply embedded values about how we think the world ought to be, values we might have mistaken for simple facts?
And if that's the case, what does that imply for how we build our communities, how we relate to each other, and how we define what a truly good life looks like?
Yeah.
It definitely encourages you to keep questioning, keep exploring those hidden values.